In this video, I'm going to show you two different approaches to direct painting and talk a bit about their pros and cons. I used a model from the website Croquis Cafe to do this, which has a large library of model videos available as a free reference for drawing and painting. And to find it, you just go on Google and search for Croquis Cafe. I just go to the Vimeo page where everything's uploaded for free, and you can just find a pose you like and screenshot it and work from that. So the first approach that I'm going to talk about is something I like to call the jigsaw puzzle method. And another way to think about it is sort of the general rule of right color, right shape. Because the whole idea is that you're trying to only place brushstrokes on the canvas that are as close as possible to those two things. You're only putting the right color in the right shape. And to extend that just a bit, it also needs to be in the right place on the canvas. But that's why the first step for both of these approaches is to do a sketch and to be as accurate as possible with your proportions and your placement of the figure. For this, I like to use a small brush and a neutral dark color like burnt umber, which is what I'm doing here. You can thin your paint down with a solvent slightly to make the lines flow more easily. You also don't want to do something like this with Vine charcoal. It stains your first paint layer when you eventually go to paint over it. Now, some artists like Yuan Uglo, for example, use pencil to sketch their figures directly on the canvas. And you know this because you can see some of the little graphite measurement lines peeking through the thinner layers of paint in some of his less built-up surfaces. And then there's someone like Alice Neel who sketches her figures with a brush and with paint, and her contour lines are always very bold and they're visible in the final painting. But she actually uses a dark blue to do it. It looks to me like ultramarine blue straight out of a tube. So if you do this, you got to prepare for that blue mixing with all your colors the same way the charcoal would, and kind of turning everything blue around the edges. So I don't really recommend that unless you have a very specific color idea and you know you want to make the figure a much cooler tone, such as like Jordan Casteel's figure paintings, where each pose is like a radically different and pretty artificial color for skin. But I think a burnt umber like I used here is the safest option. Now, the main benefit of the jigsaw puzzle approach is that it's a very efficient and easy to control way of using oil paint. It lets you avoid unnecessary layering of wet paint, which is where matching color and trying to control your edges gets really impossible. So basically what I'm doing here is mixing every color as accurately as I can before placing it on the canvas. I started off mixing a bright orange for the color of a lot of the highlights on the upper body, and all I was doing was a mixture of white, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red. But depending on the specific section of the pose, I was constantly adjusting the ratio of those three pigments to make one section a little more yellow, another a little more red, maybe one would be more washed out and there'd be more white. But looking really closely at the pose, you can see those slight variations even within the same like orangey color. And with this method, I think the more specificity you can put into your initial session, the more specific the colors will be at the end. And it'll save you less work on your second session. All these shades of orange were close enough to the same hue that I could apply them all with the same brush. And while you have that brush all loaded up with that color and you have it mixed on your palette, it's good to go through the whole pose because you have it sketched out and you're trusting in the accuracy of that sketch. You add that color wherever you see it in the pose. Besides mixing the right color, you also want to make it the right shape on the canvas. But you know that you're going to have to go back over the edge of that brushstroke when you fill in the surrounding area. But the same way a jigsaw puzzle is made up of all these irregular shapes, the shapes that different values make up are all different shapes. They're not all like cubes, or again, to go back to Yuan Uglo, he often will make the entire surface of a figure seem like geometric planes that are kind of interlocking together. But if you look closely, they're all slightly different shapes too. So he's also thinking in terms of shape. This is also where having different size brushes becomes really useful, because some areas will just have a naturally larger passage of a single color, like a whole leg might be lit with one of the same color, and if you have a brush that size, you can knock it in with one stroke, as opposed to always using the same small brush to fill in the whole figure, which can get kind of monotonous from a texture standpoint. It adds a sense of dynamics to a painting, which in musical terms, that's basically just like how loud or soft different parts of music are, and to have a variety there creates a contrast and adds a bit of excitement and energy to a piece. The same is true of brush size in a painting. Having large and small brush strokes adds a sense of dynamics to the piece. Artists like Lucian Freud and Jenny Saville both use this to great effect in their work. They have some very large and in Jenny Saville's case, like sometimes drippy and splattery parts of a painting. And then they'll also have very tiny shapes and lines and details that are clearly made with a small brush. Thanks to my raw umber ground, I was able to start with those brighter upper midtones and highlights in this painting, because that imprimatura provided the rough approximation of the shadow color that I was relating all those midtones to. But now I'm starting to add in some of the shadow colors, and let's talk a bit about mixing those. The first thing you should use is an entirely different brush from the one you just used for midtones and highlights. And that's how you'll start off making a really deep and high contrast shadow. There shouldn't be any white in that shadow color at all to begin with. You can combine the yellow and red with different amounts of the darker, cool colors on your palette, which would be the alizarin crimson or whatever cooler red pigment you have, ultramarine blue, and viridian. Now, by themselves, those colors are really quite intense and very artificial looking if you use them for skin on their own. But once you start combining them in different ratios, they neutralize each other and let you create really specific and saturated shadow colors. If you look closely at shadows, you'll see that they aren't just a darker version of a base skin tone. It's not like you take that skin tone and you just add like burnt umber to it to make it darker. If you really look closely, there's always a slight color shift that happens too. Oftentimes shadows go into the cool side of the spectrum from that base warm tone. So the shadow might appear as bluer or greener or more purple than the surrounding area. Uglo was a master of using those cool colors in shadows and making them totally convincing, but I think you see this in any figure painter who isn't afraid of color. Painting the background is an important step for both techniques I'm showing here. And if you're already using a mid-tone ground, which you kind of have to be for this technique to work at its best, it's something that you can actually save for after you've got your figure pretty well established and you've already painted its outer edges. The figure is essentially done. And then when you mix a color to use for the background, you can paint around the figure, and kind of by painting the negative space, you can create a really crisp and accurate final edge. The puzzle piece approach isn't meant to be a super strict paint by numbers kind of technique, because if you're too careful about it and you really are only placing paint on a single layer, you're kind of negating some of the best aspects of oil paint, its texture and its slow drying properties. You can see that after I got the basic regions of the pose established, there does start to be some layering and some blending of different colors as I corrected some mistakes and I tried to hone in on more and more specific color and adding details as well. So I originally recorded this second painting as an example of what not to do, but in the process of making it, my opinion has changed slightly from being never do this to something more lenient, in that if you know you are going to have a 2-session pose and you happen to like this way of working, it has its place, and I'll try to explain why and why I don't recommend it for starting out. So I'm demonstrating something I see a lot of people tempted to do when they first start figure painting from life. And I think it's a habit that comes out of acrylic painting that many of us start with, which is to fill in the entire silhouette of the figure with a base color. Like, you pick whatever you think the person's skin tone is in isolation or in bright light, and you put it everywhere. You like fill in an entire silhouette with that. And then you try to add shadows and highlights from there. And it all kind of blends into this initial silhouette. And along with adding shadows and highlights, you're trying to add detail and other nuances of color that you're starting to see. And it becomes more and more difficult to do those things as you go on. The thing you're doing when you cover the entire silhouette with a solid color is that you're making the entire surface wet for the next 3 days or more. So that entire class day that you're working, you're going to be fighting against that wet ground. And you're severely limiting your ability to change values and color or to add sharp details. So it's the same principle that explains why you never want to start off mixing a shadow color with the same brush you used for highlights that has a bunch of white and other bright colors on it, because the shadow will never get dark enough. You don't want to try to make a shadow on the canvas by darkening an already lighter color, because oil paint just doesn't work that way. Colors become a lot more homogeneous in this technique. All the colors started to relate to that same initial base tone that I put down first. And that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes you want skin to feel kind of cohesive and not so like broken apart, like the colors might have a tendency to do using the jigsaw puzzle approach I showed first. Just to give some examples of artists who make use of this wet on wet technique, a contemporary painter you may have seen before is named Genevieve Figgis, and she's kind of an extreme example because she's making use of like actually pouring paint onto a surface and letting it spread and kind of do its own thing, and they're still figurative and they're still supposed to look like specific humans, but they're clearly like using this wet on wet effect. You could also say that John Singer Sargent does this on occasion, because you can just see how smoothly blended some of his brushstrokes are. But Sargent clearly is also doing elements of the puzzle piece mentality, because his shadows are always very strong and there's a lot of contrast in his paintings. So you have to know when to start your colors fresh on a blank part of the canvas and when to make use of a bit of a base color and adjusting it from there. So just to recap, sketch out your figure first. That's true of whatever technique you use. But I highly recommend using this jigsaw puzzle piece method of blocking in the right colors and the right shapes from the very beginning of when you start mixing color, and to look as closely as you can to identify all those different colors. It does require very careful drawing before you start, so you're not putting any colors in the wrong spot. If you do, rather than just trying to paint over it with more paint, I think it's good to get in the habit of actually scraping that paint off with a palette knife and starting fresh again. You'll just have less interference and less other wet colors that don't belong there to fight against. Just be patient, gradually fit the pieces together, and then once you have a good base of all those colors, you can start worrying more about texture and blending and actually matching the surfaces that you're seeing. And overall, it's a less frustrating way to work because you're never fighting against the material.